In 2023, the United States provided about $4.8 billion in foreign food aid, with about three-quarters of that spent on emergency food assistance. This figure, which makes the United States one of the world's largest provider of food aid in absolute dollar terms, was distributed to more than 60 countries around the world. And so in this video, we're going to look at the structure, function, and evolution of the international food aid system, seeking to understand how it works and, importantly, where it doesn't. By food aid, we mean the provision of food or cash to purchase food from one country or organization to another country or population facing food insecurity or experiencing a humanitarian crisis. This is distinct from domestic food and nutrition assistance programs like food stamps, which are programs that are aimed to encourage food security at a domestic level. We consider these domestic programs in another video. Food aid is normally broken down into three categories. Emergency food aid is provided in response to sudden onset immediate crises like natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, droughts, conflicts, or displacement, with the goal of saving lives and alleviating suffering by rapidly providing basic necessities, including staple foods, ready-to-eat meals, and nutritional supplements. For most people, this is the category we think of when we think of food aid. Examples of emergency food aid include most World Food Program spending in crisis zones like Syria and Yemen, as well as emergency bilateral aid provided by individual countries. Program food aid focuses on providing food assistance as part of broader social and economic programs and is generally aimed at addressing longer-term food insecurity and malnutrition through targeted programs often focused on vulnerable groups like children, pregnant women, and the elderly. Like emergency aid, program aid can involve both in-kind food donations and cash-based transfers, but also often includes price supports and market interventions intended to stabilize or subsidize food prices. As the name suggests, it's often delivered through various programs like school feeding, supplemental feeding for malnourished children, and food for work projects. Examples of program food aid include the McGovern-Dole International Food for Education and Child Nutrition Program, through which the U.S. provides meals to school children in developing countries, and the World Food Program's nutrition programs for pregnant and lactating women in conflict areas. Finally, Project Aid supports specific development projects aimed at improving food production, livelihoods, and resilience to future shocks, which are at the root of food insecurity. It often involves infrastructure development, agricultural training, and market access initiatives. Project Aid is usually broadly focused on local capacity building through technical assistance and training. Less emphasis is placed on direct food distribution. It's normally integrated into broader developmental goals and spending, including promoting education, expanding access to healthcare, and fueling agricultural and economic development. Examples of project aid include USAID's Feed the Future initiative, which invests in agricultural development and food security in developing countries, or the International Fund for Agricultural Development's projects aimed at improving smallholder farm productivity and expanding their access to market. While it's difficult to get an exact breakdown, as the amount of spending in each category varies from year to year based on spending priorities and the scale of global crises, emergency food aid, food relief following a crisis or natural disaster, constitutes the majority of the U.S. food aid budget, generally representing between 60 and 70% of total spending. Project aid spent on things like agricultural development, school feeding programs, and nutrition initiatives is generally the second largest category at about 20 to 30% of total spending. And program aid, spending on things like food subsidies, price supports, and integration of programs into national social safety nets, is the smallest category, generally representing less than 10% of total spending. Regardless of which type of aid we're looking at, we can distinguish across three key elements. First, we can distinguish between bilateral and multilateral aid. Bilateral aid refers to assistance given directly from one country to another, a donor and a recipient. Examples of bilateral aid include the U.S. Food for Peace program, through which the U.S. provides food aid directly to individual developing countries, or programs funded through Germany's GTZ, which provides development assistance to support health and education programs across Africa. Because it does not require coordination among multiple donors, international organizations, and recipient countries, bilateral aid has the advantage of being faster to deploy and can be more flexible in implementation. But bilateral aid is often critiqued because it frequently gives the donor significant control over how the aid is used, and aid is often subject to specific conditions that reflect the political and economic policy priorities of the donor country. These conditions can include anything from economic reforms, human rights improvements, or even the purchase of goods from the donor country. Multilateral aid, on the other hand, refers to assistance given by multiple countries pooled together and distributed through international organizations like the World Food Program or the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, to a recipient country. Because donor resources are pooled, it's frequently possible to provide larger sums of money and broader resource bases for development projects. As a result, multilateral aid is often able to address global issues that require coordinated international responses like climate change, global health, or large-scale humanitarian crises more effectively than bilateral aid can. Unlike bilateral aid, which is frequently used to advance donor interests, multilateral aid is generally perceived as being more neutral and less politically motivated, as it's managed by international organizations. Because it's mediated through international organizations, multilateral aid is sometimes criticized for being more bureaucratic and less efficient than bilateral aid. It's sometimes challenging to coordinate the interests and priorities of multiple donor countries. But because they specialize in aid delivery, international organizations often have expertise that may not be available at the bilateral level. In recent years, the proportion of aid distributed through multilateral channels has expanded. But there are still important regional differences. Before the 1970s, the vast majority of aid was bilateral in nature, but since the 1980s, the proportion of aid distributed multilaterally has expanded, such that today about 40% of all aid is distributed bilaterally, though this varies according to individual donor policy. The United States and China, for example, tend to provide much more aid on a bilateral basis, while the European Union has a policy that emphasizes multilateral aid provision. Next, we can distinguish between tied and untied aid. We've alluded to this distinction already. Tied aid is granted subject to the condition that the recipient country must use the funds provided to purchase goods and services from the donor country. The aid is tied to the purchase of those goods and services. As a result of this condition, the donor's country's businesses benefit directly from the aid through guaranteed contracts and sales. But this also means that tied aid is generally less efficient because it prevents the recipient from seeking the best price and quality in the global market. As a result, tied aid generally results in higher costs and thus less aid delivery for the recipient country. Historically, the United States made extensive use of tied aid, with programs like the Food for Peace initiative requiring recipients purchase American agricultural products and be shipped on U.S.-flagged vessels. While it's difficult to get precise figures, estimates suggest that as much as about 80% of the aid provided under the program was tied, though that figure has declined to about 50% in recent years. Estimates also suggest that tied aid under the program increased the cost of food assistance by about 25 to 50% compared to untied aid or local procurement. Untied aid, on the other hand, refers to aid provided without any conditions regarding where the recipient may purchase goods and services, freeing them to procure from any source. The recipient can choose the most cost-effective and appropriate goods and services from the global market through competitive bidding processes, promoting greater efficiency and more effective use of resources. Such aid also reduces the perception of aid being a tool for the donor's economic and political interests. The European Union has largely moved to providing untied aid, and the guidelines established by the Organization for Cooperation and Development, the OECD, encourage reliance on untied aid to enhance the effectiveness of development assistance. Finally, we can distinguish between aid given as cash and aid given in kind. Cash aid involves providing financial resources directly to beneficiaries, allowing them to purchase goods and services as needed. This can include cash transfers, vouchers, or mobile money payments. Cash aid has the advantage of being flexible and efficient. Recipients generally have the freedom to spend the aid on what they need most, whether it be food, healthcare, education, or other necessities. Cash aid also reduces the logistical costs associated with transporting and storing physical goods. and it can be quicker to distribute, especially with the use of digital technologies. Further, in recent years, there's been a push to emphasize local or regional sourcing. Often, when a food crisis strikes, the impact is uneven. Farmers in some areas of the country may be devastated, while farmers in other areas might still have marketable production. By sourcing locally, cash aid can have a developmental effect, ensuring that farmers in the productive regions continue to earn a good livelihood while providing food to those in need. But for critics, cash aid runs the risk of misuse or fraud if not properly managed, and may not function well in situations where markets are disrupted. Nevertheless, cash aid is the preferred form of aid delivery for the World Food Program, which has actually shifted to using e-vouchers in places like Lebanon and Syria. USAID has also implemented cash transfer programs in various humanitarian contexts, providing families with the financial means to secure their needs during crises. In-kind aid involves the direct provision of goods and services rather than cash. Historically, this was the most common way food aid was delivered, with aid provided in the form of massive bags of grain, pallets of medical supplies, clothing, water equipment, and other physical items. This kind of aid gives donors greater control over how aid is used and ensures that specific needs are met. The physical nature of in-kind aid can make it more visible and tangible, which can be appealing to donors and the public. This is one of the reasons why we see bags of food aid typically stamped with the seal and the name of the country providing the aid. But it has several downsides. It often has higher logistical and transportation costs and risks distorting local markets in the recipient country. It's less efficient to deliver when compared to cash aid. Examples of in-kind aid include food aid delivered through the Food for Peace program, or the medical supplies, food, and shelter provided by the International Red Cross or Red Crescent during emergencies and disasters. There's been a growing trend towards cash-based assistance in recent years, as evidence suggests that it is often more efficient, effective, and empowering for recipients. However, in-kind aid still plays a crucial role in certain contexts, particularly in emergencies where markets are disrupted or specific goods or services are urgently needed. While essential in addressing hunger and food insecurity, food aid has been subject to numerous critiques and controversies, prompting ongoing debates and calls for reform. So let's conclude by looking at some of those critiques and proposed reforms. First, many critics argue that providing free or subsidized food can disrupt local markets and create dependency on external assistance. By flooding local markets with free or heavily subsidized food, local farmers and producers often cannot compete, leading to decreased local food production and long-term dependency on aid. In Haiti, for example, the influx of free rice from international aid programs led to a decline in local rice production, as Haitian farmers could not compete with the free imports. And in Ethiopia, decades of food aid have led to concerns about the country's dependency on international assistance rather than on developing its own agricultural sector. To counter this tendency, there's been an effort to move away from in-kind aid, which tends to amplify the problem, and towards cash aid, which permits local procurement, which is sometimes also called local sourcing, where food is purchased on local markets when available, or through triangular aid. Triangular aid is where a donor country provides funding to a recipient country, which then purchases food from a third country in the same region. Both local procurement and triangular aid have several advantages over traditional aid. First, and most obviously, overcomes the disincentive effects we just mentioned. But it's also frequently more cost-effective, as it dramatically reduces shipping and transportation costs and reduces the need for expensive storage facilities. Because it's sourced locally on local and regional markets, such aid can also be normally delivered more rapidly than aid being shipped around the world, enabling a quicker response to emergency conditions. It can help ensure that the food delivered is culturally appropriate and familiar to the recipients, and it can even have secondary developmental effects on local and regional economies, boosting local agriculture in the regions where the food is sourced. Food aid has often been used as a political tool to advance donor countries' strategic interests rather than for the benefit of the recipient country. This can involve tying aid to political conditions, supporting donor governments, or introducing certain economic reforms. This was particularly common during the Cold War period, when both the United States and the Soviet Union used foreign aid as a tool to secure alliances and influence developing countries. Today, the United States and China both use foreign aid in a similar manner. But critics argue that shifting from bilateral aid to multilateral aid would help to minimize this impact. Food aid, especially when delivered as tied or in-kind aid, tends to be inefficient and costly. The logistics of transporting food from one country to another can significantly increase the cost of aid. U.S. in-kind food aid, for example, has been shown to be 30 to 50% more expensive than locally or regionally sourced food. Further, logistical challenges, corruption, and lack of coordination can lead to delays in delivery, misappropriation of resources, and aid not reaching those who need it most. Indeed, a number of studies have concluded that a significant portion of food aid is lost or wasted during transportation and storage, particularly in conflict-affected regions. Because of this, critics have suggested that greater reliance on cash aid and local or regional procurement through triangular aid would increase the efficiency and timeliness of aid deliveries. Finally, food aid is often criticized for the market distortion effects it has on recipient countries, particularly in the context of dumping. In international trade, dumping is the term that's given to the practice of giving or selling large quantities of surplus quantities at prices below the cost of production or below the prices in the recipient country's markets. Food aid has long been a mechanism of surplus disposal for donor countries, getting commodities off domestic markets to ensure that prices on those markets do not fall too low. But for the recipient country, they can have a similar effect, driving down prices and undercutting local farmers who cannot compete with the artificially low prices of the imported food. This can often force farmers, food processors, and retailers out of business, exacerbating poverty and unemployment and creating a dependency on cheap imported food. The United States has regularly been accused of using food aid to dump surplus agricultural commodities, especially rice and wheat, on the markets of developing countries. And the European Union has been criticized for subsidizing its own dairy industry, leading to overproduction and dumping of surplus milk powder on developing countries, undermining local production. To avoid this, critics argue that cash and local procurement could be used. Additionally, critics argue that promoting fair trade practices to ensure that farmers in developing countries receive fair prices for their products would let them compete on a more level playing field, but that's a topic for another video. We've seen progress in addressing some of the shortcomings in the international food aid regime. There's a growing trend towards providing cash or voucher-based assistance instead of in-kind food aid in recent years, allowing beneficiaries to purchase food and other necessities locally, supporting local markets, and giving recipients more flexibility. The World Food Program, for example, has significantly increased its use of cash-based transfers, which now account for over 30% of its assistance. Alongside the monetization of food aid, there's also been greater emphasis on local or regional procurement of food. As we've previously mentioned, this has the benefit of reducing costs and ensuring more culturally appropriate foods while also providing an important developmental benefit for the region. Donors have strengthened efforts to improve transparency, monitoring, and accountability in food aid programs, which are being strengthened to reduce corruption and to ensure the aid reaches its intended recipients. And there's been a greater focus on integrating food aid with other long-term development goals to build resilience and reduce dependency, with the long-term goal of addressing the root causes of food insecurity rather than just its symptoms. While food aid remains a crucial tool for addressing global hunger and food emergencies, it's essential to continue to reform food aid practices to address the criticisms and improve the effectiveness and efficiency of aid delivery. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.